Good morning, men. Let's get started here. So go ahead and find a chair. Boy, that quieted it down quick. So you see a paper on your table, and it's talking about men in ministry. So go ahead and share a little bit about that.
This is a flyer that's on your table, and it's telling you about a luncheon that we're going to have on December the 15th. And this Ryan Derelick will be our speaker at that luncheon. And he's got an amazing story on how he came to Christ. And the purpose of the luncheon, the full purpose of the luncheon, is evangelism, is outreach. So what we would like you to do is find somebody that you think needs to hear the gospel. Bring them to the luncheon. The luncheon is free for you and your guest. Please do not come if you do not have a guest that you think needs to hear the gospel. That's the whole purpose of the luncheon. So it's December the 15th. Bring a guest, and shows on here you have to register. The restaurant has limited space, so please go in on the network and register.
Thanks, Don. Well, good morning, good morning. Man, what great weather we've had, huh? It was so hot yesterday. I was driving down the road, and it was so hot I saw a dog chasing a cat, and they were both walking, you know? It was so hot I saw two dogs fighting over a fire hydrant. I mean, it was hot out yesterday. So, hey, today I want to talk a little bit about courage. And our whole theme for the men's breakfast, the Whole Heart Men's Breakfast, now through January, is talking about courage. So what is it? You know, how do we develop it? So that's what I'm going to be sharing about today. So if you want to come in, grab a seat, everyone. Guys, have you ever been so hungry, you're like starving, not literally, but figuratively, and you look around the house, and nothing really appeals to you. You go through all the cupboards, the fridge, the leftovers, the freezer, and man, nothing's really doing it for you. So you get in your car, you go to a restaurant, you look over the menu, and man, it's like listening to Charlie Brown's teacher, you know, wah, 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 wah. Everything looks blah. But then you see a server carrying a tray full of food for the table right next to you. And you see something on that tray that catches your eye. And you sit up and take attention immediately. You think, man, that looks good. I wonder what that is. And she drops off the food and comes by your table to get your drink order. And you said, hey, that table you just brought the food to, the guy in the blue shirt, what'd you bring him? And she tells you. And you say, hey, man, that's what I want. That looked really good. I think I'm going to have that. Sometimes we don't know what we want in our own lives until we see it lived out in someone else's. And courage is a lot like that. One of the things I like about Pastor Steve, what I love about him, is that he lives his life, he lives courage daily. He lives it out on a daily basis. And when we see someone being courageous, it strengthens the spine of others and ourselves to stand up, make a stand, and do the same. So what is courage? I think courage is just the ability to act during fear. Valor is a lot like courage. Valor is the ability to be courageous in battle. You know, heroes are fortunate in battle. There's not a lot of heroes during peacetime. So courage is the ability to step out and trust God. Even though there's fear, you step out anyway. You know, we don't have to understand completely or fully to obey totally. Does that make sense? We don't have to understand all the details in order for us to start obeying completely. Where there's unconditional love, courage and joy are a reflex. So here's the thing. Courage can be cultivated. When David, in 2 Samuel 16, when David was bringing the food down to his brothers, And the whole army of Israel was standing there as Goliath had come out and taunt them every day. Said, who's going to take me on? And the Israelites were in fear. And David took the meals down to his brothers. And it really infuriated him that this uncircumcised Philistine would stand up and defile the armies of God. So he went to Saul and he said, I'm the man. I can take these guys on. And David was just a young lad at the time, you know, a ruddy little kid. And Saul kind of laughed at him. And David said, your servant here has killed the lion, and I've killed the bear, and I'm going to do the same thing to this uncircumcised Philistine because he's defying the armies of God. So David's private victories preceded his public ones. And he learned courage by practicing it. I mean, by stepping out on a daily basis. So courage can be developed. It can be learned. Nothing determines one's ability or your ability to lead other people more than what you're doing, men, on a daily basis to lead yourselves. So what are you doing? You know, every time we hear the voice of God, or we think we hear the voice of God, and we step out and it is the voice of God, and we act upon it, it makes it that much easier to step out and act upon the voice of God the next time it happens. And we learn to listen and obey. Listen and obey. There's a Hebrew word for that. It's called shama, and it's really one action, to listen and to obey. You know, I think the biggest weapon of the enemy are weapons of mass distraction, because there's really so many things vying for our attention. So how do we distinguish God's voice from every other voice, every tone, every inflection, every nuance of God's voice? And then how do we learn to act upon it? Well, it begins by just, once you sense it, God, just reaching out and acting upon it. And once you know it's God, by the results, it makes it easier to do it again and again and again. So it can really become a habit. You know what they say about habits? You know what they say about bad habits? A bad habit's like it's like a comfortable bed. Boy, it's easy to get into, but it's hard to get out of, you know? So how do you get rid of bad habits? Well, you get rid of them by replacing them with good habits. And so good habits can be established. So here's 4 things to help you establish or develop courage as a habit. Number 1, start hanging out with courageous people. We tend to be like the 5 guys we hang out with the most. One of the discussion questions are you hanging out with the right crowd? Are they courageous? And if they're not, you know, maybe you're hanging out with the wrong crowd. If you have friends like mine, raise your glasses. If you don't have friends like mine, raise your standards. Because we tend to be like the 5 guys we hang out with the most. So hang out with courageous people, because iron sharpens iron. Let them be your blood-stained allies. I just love that term. Number 2, first one, hanging out with courageous people. Number 2, read about courageous people. You know, I've given away most of the books I have. I still have a bunch of books, but I'm giving away hundreds of books. I'd read them, and I thought, well, it's up here. I don't need any more. Maybe someone can be blessed by it. But I had a bookshelf, and probably 3 of the shelves were just on revival. Because I figured what God did before, he can do again. And God, open up those wells of revival and let me be a conduit for that. But I read about the heroes of faith. And one of the people that I admire the most, I don't know, how many of you heard of Ruth Ward Heflin? So a couple hands. Ruth Ward Heflin has gone on to be with the Lord, but there's no one that's ministered to more heads of the state than Ruth Ward Heflin, more than anyone in recorded history. And even when she was real little, her parents ran this revival camp in Ashland, Virginia. And she told her parents that, I think I'm supposed to be a missionary to China. She was like 12 or 13. And her parents are like, Ruth, that's kind of young. We don't know if we can let you go at 12 or 13. But they heard her, every night they'd hear her praying, and they'd say, Ruth, Ruth, go to bed, it's late. But they heard her praying, and it sounded different. So they got up, and they went to her room, to the door, and they opened it up, and she was sleeping. And she was praying in fluent Chinese, and no one had taught her. And they thought, well, that's a good sign to send her. So she went to Hong Kong and China, I think, as a 13-year-old, as a missionary. God would tell her things like, go to Ethiopia. And she'd say, well, God, I don't have any money. God said, well, I didn't ask you if you had money. Just go to Ethiopia. So she'd go to the airport, and there'd be, 12 people in line, then 10, 8, 7, 5, 3. And she'd say, God, I don't have any money. God said, just get a ticket. So she'd go up there and say, I need a one-way ticket to Ethiopia. And as she did, someone would come up and say, God just told me to pay for your ticket wherever you're going. And her whole life was filled like that. She lived courage in the midst of fear and reaching out. She had a dream one time, and she saw this man in her dream. And she was living in Virginia, but she had a friend that lived in D.C., and her friend was about to visit the Bhutanese embassy, Bhutan, country of Bhutan. And her friend said, you want to go? She said, sure. So she walked in the door, and on the wall was a picture of a guy that was in her dreams. And she told the ambassador for Bhutan, who is that guy? He was in my dream. I have a message for him from God. She said, that's the king of Bhutan. And he says, I can make that happen. At the time, Bhutan was a closed country. It opened up in, I think, January of 93. In the beginning, they only let about 5,000 people in the country a year. And this was, I think, before that. And so she got in. She got to minister to every member of the royal family in Bhutan when it was a closed country. And the prince became a really good friend. And a couple years later, his dad died, and he became the king. So she had access to the king of Bhutan just by reaching out and being courageous and doing what God told her to do. So read about courageous people, because when I do, it builds up my faith. So number 1 was hang out with courageous people. Number 2, read about courageous people. Number 3, practice listening and obeying. And start praying for people. I don't sleep a lot. And so probably less than anyone I know. And partly is because in the middle of the night, a lot of times, God will come and grab my shoulder and just nudge me and wake me up. And I'll just say, who do you want me to pray for? And I know that's what he wants me to do. And I'll do that. And so I remember praying for, I came out here in 1997, visiting my brother who was living out here, sleeping on his couch. God woke me up about 2 in the morning. And he says, I want you to pray for Ken Hepner. And I'd met Ken a couple times. I pastored or ministered in his church a couple times in Pennsylvania. Didn't know a lot about him. I knew his wife's name. Didn't know if he had kids. But I started praying for his son. I didn't know if he had a son. Started praying for his son, and I saw that he was living on the streets and just really, really backslidden. And I saw God get a hold of him. And he had a Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus, God encounter. And I saw God using him to unite many streams of ministry. So next morning I called Ken and I said, Ken, God woke me up in the middle of the night and I started praying for your son. The first question is, do you have one? He said, well, yes, I do. He said, but let me tell you before you even say a word, he's living on the streets right now. He's really backslidden. And I said, that's what I saw. And I said, but I saw get a hold of his life and really grip him. And I saw him leading all these streams of ministry before the Lord. And he said, man, I'd love for that to happen. 4 months later, I get a call from Ken. And he said, guess what happened? So God got a hold of his son. And that's what he's doing now. And he's still serving God to this day. We should talk to God about people before we talk to people about God. And so practice listening and obeying. Listening and obeying. When you do that, you can hear God in the midst of a crowd. No matter how busy my day is, God is speaking all the time. And so I'm learning to distinguish his voice from every other voice. Michael Enos is part of our men's group here, that teaches a great class, How to Hear the Voice of God. And if you don't know how, man, he's a good guy to talk to because he'll teach you how. So number 1, hang out with courageous people. Number 2, read about courageous people. Number 3, practice listening, obey. And number 4, ask God to show you how he wants you to love on people. And so one thing I wake up every morning. I wake up like a 5-year-old on Christmas morning, just full of expectancy because I think today could be the day. Today could be the day, God, that you break forth in your suddenlies. And then I say, God, give me a due word in due season for everyone that crosses my path. And he does that. So right when I got saved, like 2 days after I got saved, I mean, I had no church background, nothing. And I'm in a church service for the first time being saved. And I don't know if you know Marilyn Hickey, but she visited our church that day. This is in Minnesota. And she had a word for me, and she said, stand up. And I thought she was talking to someone else. She said, no, you there in the blue shirt. And so I stood up, and she said, I got a word for you, and it's Proverbs 4:8, exalt her and she'll promote thee. And the her, it's talking about his wisdom. So if you keep running with God, he's going to give you wisdom beyond your years. So there's times that some things will come out of my mouth that I know they're wisdom from God because I'm not that smart, you know. And I know it probably wasn't me. And so, but that's what happens when I say, God, give me a due word in due season for everyone that crosses my path. And throughout the day, that's what happens. So I end up praying, you know, a number of different times just through people, just I'm meeting. And I've learned to be courageous, and it becomes a habit. Unconditional love always produces expectancy, joy, and courage. So it's a byproduct. So I have a couple of life application questions. I wanted to make this quick so you guys have a lot of time in your groups today. And the first one, if you guys can put those up. Are you hanging out with the right crowd? And are they courageous? If they're not, I would say examine the people you hang out with. I want to be the dumbest person in the room in any group I'm with. I used to hang out on Wednesday mornings for first few years I was out here with this group of world changers. And our schedules got really busy, and so I'm not able to hang out with them. One of them, his son married Pence's daughter. Another one that used to live with Duncan Campbell from the Welsh Revival. Another one started the whole education system for Papua New Guinea. These guys are world changers, and I was like the little kid in the room full of giants, you know. But I loved it because they bolstered my faith. They made me courageous. So, are you hanging out with the right crowd? Are they contagious? And number 2, what's one positive thing you can begin doing today that will replace a negative habit you've developed? We all have things in our lives that we're probably wish we did a little bit differently. I know I do. And so this made me examine my own self. What are some things I can start doing now as I'm looking in the mirror that would replace some of the bad habits I have? Because I don't want to be the same person next year that I am today. You know, God's not a mass producer. He's a hand crafter. He grows each of us a little bit differently. And we're all unfinished versions of what we will become. I don't want to be the same person next year that I am today. I want to be running with God even a little bit more in love with God than I currently am. And so go ahead and look at these questions. So all the first-timers, if you want to rise up, I'm going to take you guys to a different room. Anybody that's a first-timer that's sitting with